All right, how you guys doing? My name's Josh Caskey, and I'm a history major, so if you guys hate history, I apologize. Totally switching gears here. So I did my thesis on George Marshall. Just a very, very quick background. He was chief of staff from 1939 to 1945. Obviously, anybody who knows a little bit about history knows that we had the Second Great World War going on, and he was instrumental in the success that the Americans had, along with the rest of the Allies as well. He was Secretary of State. Possibly his biggest achievement came during this time frame, the Marshall Plan, and also was Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. So my main points that I covered in my paper were basically, I wanted to focus on a time frame that was very important. So I focused on 1939 to 1951, and that was World War II, the Marshall Plan, as well as the beginning of the Korean War. A lot of people don't realize, but the military that we see today, we've kind of stayed on a war footing, even when we weren't at war, even in the 80s, late 70s, 80s. That stems from Marshall. He built a military up that was decimated. When he took over in 1939, we had 175,000 soldiers in the Army. Today, I believe we're over 1.5 million, and we can credit that to his buildup. He was also instrumental in being a great organizer of the victories in Europe and Japan, and some of the most famous generals he put into place, and this includes Omar Bradley and George Patton. He also was a key planner in the Normandy invasion, also known as Operation Overlord, and obviously was the biggest amphibious beach landing in the history of the United States service members, and it was a huge success and a turning point for the war. And obviously, that I talked about the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Plan, huge for Europe, mainly Western Europe, who ended up accepting the plan. Over $13 billion doled out to these countries, and it sped up the recovery process. It probably would have happened in about 10 to 15 years, but over the course of 4 years, industries took off, and we see Europe today is still benefiting from that plan, or benefited from the plan, not benefiting still. So just quick background, he's from Uniontown, not too far from here. He graduated from VMI, Virginia Military Institute, very prestigious school in Virginia. He was the chief of staff. He was a 5-star general, which we haven't had a 5-star general in a very long time. And the creator of the Marshall Plan, and he was a Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. And he was actually part of the process to point his finger, proverbially, at MacArthur. And MacArthur famously kept going in Korea and wanted to go all the way into China. And Marshall had to come down on literally one of his buddies, somebody that he had served with. And he received a Nobel Peace Prize. A lot of people say, well, a military guy getting a Nobel Peace Prize, that's kind of weird. He was a very, very peace-minded person for somebody who's in the military. Not all people that serve in the military. I'm a military guy myself. I'm a retired Marine, and we're not all just crazed killers. He was a compassionate guy who cared about the work that he did. So let's talk about his buildup of the military. Like I said, 175,000 soldiers to 8 million strong. World War II is a war that we know as total war, meaning everybody was part of this war. It affected everybody. Overseas, it affected people with their lives as well, civilians, in the tens of millions. It took everything and everybody that we had to make World War II happen, and he was a huge part in this process. He established the WAC and the WAAC, which is women that served in the military, but women that weren't in the military, but supported the military as well. And obviously, not obviously, but the modernization that we see today is actually largely in part to him. He was big on getting aircraft to be used prior to that in World War I. They'd only been used for reconnaissance. And in World War II, the dogfights that you hear so much about, that this was a new thing. This was something that had never been seen before. And that goes with tactics as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about Operation Overlord. And then mechanized troops as well, something that we still use today. Like I said, he put many generals on the spots that they were. He was actually asked to lead the D-Day invasion, and then he said, well, you know, if that's what you want, that's what I'll do to FDR. And FDR said, well, he kind of rethought it when he said it like that, and he said, well, maybe I could use you in Washington instead. So he ended up putting Eisenhower, and that's the type of man that Marshall was, and I talk a lot about it in my paper. He was a man dedicated to service. But he was a lead role in the planning of the D-Day invasion. It's a 2-year process. Initially, they wanted to go through the underbelly of Europe, which was Italy. We had major casualties in Italy already, from Anzio, Monte Cassino, throughout the countryside. And that was supposed to be the D-Day invasion initially, and they changed it to the Normandy coast, and it was a major turning point. So, like I said, 2 years for the buildup, and he was needed in DC, so that's what he did. Largest amphibious assault the world has ever seen. I said that once, and I'll say it again. This was a monumental assault. This was not just U.S. troops, but Canadian troops and British troops, and that was kind of the idea of getting everybody together. That was a concept that I wouldn't say that he championed, but he did very well with. And he was the architect of this cross-channel. I don't want to get into military tactics, but the cross-channel attack, a lot of lives were lost at Normandy, but throughout World War II, many lives were lost. And it took daring raids, amazing leadership, but also I want to focus on the fact that amazing men at the lowest levels that were pulling off the impossible, really. He studied defeats in North Africa, and a good leader always learns from their mistakes, and that's exactly what he did, and it turned out to be a turning point in the war. The Marshall Plan was the European Recovery Act, $13.1 to $13.4 billion doled out. That's over $130 billion in today's money. And it kind of positioned, it positioned the U.S. as the de facto leader of the Western world, and we're still there today. Largest money went to Great Britain, France, and Germany. When I say Germany, West Germany, because East Germany was Soviet, and the Soviets, Marshall wanted the Soviets to be included, and they wanted nothing to do with the Marshall Plan. So built into the Marshall Plan was the idea of containment. And he utilized people such as Dean Acheson, the Undersecretary, as well as George Kennan, who had the famous long telegram about how to deal with the Soviets and stop communism from spreading. So that was built in there, and economically was a success. Containment, some people would say it's a success, some people say it wasn't. Some people said we were blinded by the fear of communism, but regardless, the Marshall Plan was hugely successful. It removed trade barriers, and it benefited our economy. It wasn't all about the Europeans. It's about us. It's not just about your allies, but it's about yourself as well. And then at the bottom there, I talk a little bit about lessening interstate barriers and regulation and unions growing in Europe. And that was obviously very important. In West Germany, industrialized. They were already industrialized, but their output was humongous after the Marshall Plan. So just to wrap up here, I put organizational genius. Maybe genius is a little strong, and maybe I'm a little partial to him, but he was instrumental in all the major occurrences from 1939 to 1951, which in U.S. history is huge. An ethical guy, very ethical in everything he did. He also did decide, he gave his input on the atomic bomb, and some people would say, well, that's pretty unethical. It was definitely a hard decision for him, but he did say that it needed to happen, and he pointed out to all the losses in Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and obviously that's a huge decision, and a lot of people would say maybe a wrong decision as well. Nobody's perfect, that's for sure, and he made his mistakes. Also, Pearl Harbor, he didn't see it coming. Now, luckily, there was destroyers that were missing that day, and it was a Sunday, or the casualties would have been a lot higher. A lot of people would have been on their workstations. Marshall Plan was hugely successful. He was a chief of staff, as well as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, but he never was a politician. He was kind of a military politician in his own right. by the simple fact that he got along with people in Washington somehow, even people that nobody could get along with, and he was able to make things happen, and he garnered bipartisan support. My last bullet, possibly the most influential guy of the 20th century. I'll leave that up to you. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Any questions? Sorry.
I have a comment. I grew up in a housing complex that was paid by the Marshall Plan.
Where was this at?
Turkey.
Oh, in Turkey.
Yeah,
Okay.
13 years of my life.
Wow. I was actually born in Turkey.
You were born in
Yeah.
Turkey? So am I.
Yeah.
So was I.
I was born
What city?
I was born in Adana and lived in Izmir.
Incirlik. Both
Incirlik, yeah.
Yeah, both are NATO
My dad
bases.
worked with NATO, so
NATO bases, yeah.
yeah.
And our
1981.
uncles graduated from a college that was built by the Marshall Plan.
Really?
Our uncles.
That's interesting.
Yeah. It's called Middle East Technical University.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
How cool.
Yeah.
Anybody else? All right. Thank you.